So what's the role of leadership, right? Leadership, I think, is to get to the politics of addition, right? Hey, let's begin conversations with what we can agree on, and we could get a lot done if we just focused on what we can agree on. How about injecting some more civility into our political discourse,
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm starting to lose faith in the political class to do that, man. They're not going to do it. So we can't wait for the political class to do that.
Right.
Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Fellow travelers, welcome back to the Civic Brief. I'm Ike Wilson. Now, this month, we open not only our 2026 series, but this episode 1, is going to find us returning, really framing the whole year, the whole programmatic year of season 2 of the Civic Brief. So, want to thank our guests, and I'll introduce him here properly here in a second, for being the right person at the right time to help us kick off a year, a 250th anniversary of the American Democratic Republic. So a great exceptional providence there as well. And we're going to be kicking off, of course, the first month of the year, but also really framing and introducing a meta theme for our whole year of conversations on the Civic Brief. We're going to return to the beginning of America's founding and framing core principles, and specifically what I call paradoxes. We're not doing the revisit to romanticize those paradoxes, but in fact to reckon with them. They're cyclical. They shaped and framed our original cause for revolution and the creation of our nation state back in 1776. And they've been cyclical. These paradoxes come back over time at major transition moments in the social contract of the governed in our government as part of American political development. Could not think of a better person than our guest today to have us explore and fence a little bit about those paradoxes. Being an American, it's not only a right, but a duty, and a hard-earned duty to grapple over time with the paradoxes that lie core to our American self. And that's where we're going to begin that conversation today deliberately. America, again, was born in paradox, a republic committed to liberty that tolerated exclusion. We just got to be honest about that. A nation wary of centralized power that built a global order sustained by that same type of centralized power, right? And we're living with that today. In a compound world, that is where domestic polarization, technological disruption, strategic competition, and legitimacy crises converge, really collide. Those founding contradictions are no longer abstractions. Once again, they have returned and become the operational pressures undergirding how America and Americans go forward together, or somewhat disunited at different times and contexts. These paradoxes, they shape how we lead, how we deter, how we govern, and how we imagine our future. Today, I'm joined with Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, soldier, scholar, historian, strategist, to examine why old American strategy may no longer be enough, necessary but insufficient, and why honest engagement with our paradox and our paradoxes may be the first essential act of national renewal. General McMaster, welcome to the Civic Brief. It's truly an honor to have you with us today.
Hey, Ike, it's great to be with you.
Awesome. Okay, General, before we were preambling, before we went live here, and I explained, my travelers, my followers know me well, and you know me very well, and you know that I am both gifted and cursed, emphasis on the curse, with the gift of gab. One of those gifts that keeps on giving. So, you've agreed that, with this being the opening framer, not only for the month of January experience with the Civic Brief, but for the whole year, I'm going to give a little bit longer and thicker of an opening framing. I apologize up front. Some of this may embarrass you, but there's a reason why I wanted to get you on this opening, because you're really your own background, your professional life really is an exemplar of a lot of those paradoxes and how America has led through those paradoxes in good ways and in sometimes challenging and bad ways, and with some ugliness along the way. That's just the nature of strategy. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper through some of your background, going back, frankly, to your Gulf War I, first Gulf War experiences, very briefly, but I think importantly for our listeners, our readers, our fellow travelers to have an appreciation. So please, everyone, bear with me. This is, let me kind of set the stage here for our conversation. Now, General, you're one of those rare American figures whose professional life spans battlefield courage, intellectual rigor, and service at the very center of power and force, and crucially, whose career has unfolded at inflection points in American history. Your story in many ways mirrors the paradoxes we're here to discuss today, or begin that discussion about today. You first came to the national attention not in Washington, D.C., but in the desert during the first Gulf War at the Battle of 73 Easting. And travelers, if you are not familiar with the Battle of 73 Eastings, please just Google or whatever the equivalent verbiage is for how you search for things on the World Wide Web, and do a little study on the Battle of 73 Eastings. There's a lot of great stuff out there, some great YouTube podcasts and that capture an oral history of this seminal battle. And I'll explain that very briefly here now. As a young cavalry officer, sir, you led what remains one of the most studied armored tank engagements in modern warfare, destroying a numerically superior Republican Guard force through disciplined initiative, clarity of purpose, and mission command under fire. That battle alone would have secured your place in military history and beyond, frankly. But what makes your career exceptional, in my view anyway, is what followed. Early on, you turned a critical eye inward, and you continue to turn that critical eye throughout your professional life. In this instance, early on in your career, towards American civil military decision-making itself. Your book, Dereliction of Duty, challenged comforting myths about Vietnam and the Vietnam War, arguing that strategic failure often begins not with bad intentions, but with institutional silence, groupthink, and the erosion of professional candor. That work wasn't just historical scholarship. It was a warning, and a warning that we need to heed, frankly, bluntly, that we need to heed today. Later on, in Iraq, particularly in Tal Afar, Iraq, northern Iraq, you helped pioneer population-centric counterinsurgency at a critical moment when the United States was relearning, painfully, that wars are won not just against enemies, but most importantly, for societies. You demonstrated that legitimacy, restraint, local partnership, and political purpose are not luxuries in war, they're the decisive terrain. That through line carried into your service as National Security Advisor during the first Trump administration, where you operated at the intersection of unmatched American power and force, and frankly, growing strategic incoherence. A moment when assumptions about U.S. primacy, alliances, and norms were all under strain amid a dramatically global system in transition and amid that ambiguity that comes with those kinds of transitions. Since then, through your recent books, teaching, and public engagement, you've continued to insist on a core idea that anchors today's conversation. Simply put, that strategic competence begins with strategic honesty. And that brings us to this particular moment. We're recording this again in January 2026 at what I could and will argue is an epochal systems level transition in the character of global geopolitical competition, conflict, and war. We're witnessing, to state it as kind and diplomatically as I can or choose to, a new muscularity in American leadership abroad, certainly, but also at home. Across the global chessboard, compound security dilemmas are stacking, they're converging, they're feeding back into one another. Just a quick list. And we're bombarded with them day by day, minute by minute. Russia's war against Ukraine, grinding into a protracted contest of endurance. Israel-Gaza, reshaping the regional security order in the Middle East. China-Taiwan, sitting at the center of a technologically accelerated deterrence contest. Venezuela, the Caribbean, and a reanimated hemispheric assertiveness that we're now calling Monroe Doctrine 2.0, stretched across an expanded greater Western hemisphere. A tariffs-driven protectionist global economic posture that would make President McKinley's Gilded Age America blush, frankly. And simultaneously, what I'll call a growing illiberalism on the home front, where civic trust, international legitimacy, or institutional legitimacy that is and democratic restraint are increasingly contested. America remains the most forceful nation on earth. But force, in what really matters, power, real power, today is no longer unitary. It's compounded again. Military, economic, technological, informational, moral, and civic, interacting across domains in ways that magnify both strength and fragility. As the great Bob Dylan once put it, the times they are changing. So today's question is not whether America leads. Certainly America leads. The question is more about how America leads, and to what ends, and at what cost, especially when the founding paradoxes of the Republic are no longer background noise, but again, once again, front page variables and strategic competition. So, General McMaster, with that framing, let's genuinely begin. And first, I want to give you the microphone, sir. I want to give you the mic, maybe for your own opening comments. And frankly, I hope that some of the opening comments, might take advantage of, fencing and contending with some of, with and against some of the framing that I've actually laid out here before us. And then we'll get right into the conversation, starting with the founding paradox, American strategy in a world of compounding threats. Again, thanks so much, General McMaster, for being with us. The mic's yours.
Hey, I'll just offer just a few comments up front about the nature of the geostrategic environment these days. I think what we're facing essentially is what I would call an axis of aggressors centered on two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of the People's Republic of China and Russia. And essentially what China and Russia have done is pulled into the fold the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world in North Korea, and the theocratic dictatorship in Iran, as well as others who are fellow travelers with them, who can reinforce their efforts in this hemisphere. For example, Venezuela, which was has been the linchpin for their efforts to essentially create new spheres of influence around the world in an effort that they share between China and Russia to rewrite the rules of international discourse in favor of their authoritarian forms of government, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model.
Yeah.
And if they were to succeed, that would make the world less free, less prosperous, and less safe. Now, fortunately, I think for us, they were emboldened by a perception of weakness in the United States and in the Western world, more broadly, in the belief that we were weak, divided, decadent, and they were emboldened by this perception of weakness, which I think in recent years you can trace back to the disastrous and deadly self-defeat and humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Yeah,
I think you draw a direct line between that and the massive reinvasion of Ukraine just about 8 months later.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that perception of weakness was reinforced when we were unable to sustain support for Ukraine with weapons and munitions in the 2022 to 2023 period. And this is when I think Ayatollah Khamenei looked at his to-do list and thought it was time to destroy Israel off that to-do list, and lit the ring of fire around Israel with the horrible mass murder, rape, kidnapping attacks that occurred on October 7, 2023.
Yeah.
Since that time, though, what we have seen is that these authoritarian regimes, while they tend to appear strong from the outside because they're great at parades, they're great at suppressing and demobilizing opposition, they're actually quite fragile. And so whereas our democratic form of government, all the ugliness and everything is for everybody to see. I think that these regimes are now showing how brittle they are, whether it's Iran, which is spiraling downward in terms of the ability of that theocratic dictatorship to survive, whether it's Venezuela, when you now see I think there will be a change in government where the Chavistas have to leave. That's going to take some time. But also in China, where they've created real frailties in their economy in the race to surpass us, and Russia, which is in a position of profound weakness. So this creates an opportunity, if we take it, in the United States and with our allies and partners to prevail over the aggression of this axis.
General, we talked before about, it's always a must have a plan. We have a plan today of how we're going to have this conversation, but thank goodness no plan survives first contact. You gave us excellent first contact in terms of that fencing against my framing foil to really lay out due cause and explanation for getting at that change of character in global geopolitical competition, the rise of the 2+4 or 2+5 axis. Growing axis of opposition. They call it resistance. One man's resistance is another community's opposition, right? But you've given a brilliant layout. I was planning on doing this later. I want to go back to, and I've revisited this a lot since you and your counterpart in as the economic advisor when you were national security advisor, Gary Cohn, in a 30 May 2017 Wall Street Journal commentary. You wrote a seminal piece. I still regard it as the most cogent and comprehensive articulation of America First 2.0. I'll call it 2.0 U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration. I refer to people constantly to go back to look at that, and of course, what derived from that was the 2018 national security strategy, defense strategy, and I would hold that defense strategy for what it's worth up as an exemplar. I mean, I think it's one of our best national security strategies. I don't necessarily agree with everything substantively in it. I'm an American citizen. I have a right. But I think in terms of getting the framing right and the due logic and cause behind America's foreign policy and security strategy and defense strategy undergirding it, I think it's an exemplar document. And again, I'm not doing that. I'm not saying that in old soldier language to blow smoke up your fourth point of contact at all, sir. But one thing that has haunted me in the best of ways, in some ways that caused me to grapple with these paradoxes, I'm going to read this excerpt from that article. And here's a quote. We engage with the world, not to impose our way of life, but to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. That means identifying the interests and principles that make America uncommon and advancing them in the Middle East with our NATO allies, with the G7 nations and beyond. Here's the really poignant part, at least for me. The president embarked on his first foreign trip with a clear-eyed outlook that the world is not a global community, but an arena where nations, non-governmental actors, and businesses engage and compete for advantage. We bring to this, the United States brings to this forum, unmatched military, political, economic, cultural, and moral strength. Rather than deny this elemental nature of international affairs, we embrace it. I think that is elegant. I think it's eloquent, certainly eloquent, but I think it's an elegant articulation of that change in the character of global geopolitical competition that you've put texture onto today. So I would ask you to contemporize that. Does that hold today? And where does the United States specifically, maybe diving a bit more into our own domestic aspects and sources of our foreign and security policy abroad? How do we comport in terms of strength, or somewhere on the spectrum of strength and fragility in paradox between home and abroad, and in the face of that characterization of the world as it has changed?
Well, what we were getting at there was that the assumptions that we made about the post-Cold War world were clearly, by 2017, they were flawed assumptions.
Yeah.
Those being that, an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies and over closed authoritarian systems, that great power rivalry and competition was a relic of the past, and that our prowess, our technological military prowess in particular, would guarantee our security well into the future. By 2017, it was clear that that a condominium of nations was not going to emerge, such that we could work on global issues under the auspices of international organizations cooperatively, and that we were dealing with these two revanchist powers, and had to recognize the nature of the competition, because because of those flawed assumptions, we had vacated critical arenas of competition, economic and security and diplomatic arenas of competition. So I think that still holds. I think what's happened is in the period of time that followed, I think is during the Biden administration in particular, the axis of aggressors became emboldened, as I mentioned, based on the perceived weakness about Afghanistan, but also in this period of time, the Biden administration was doing its best to kind of placate Iran to try to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal. It wasn't responding to scores of attacks against by the Iranian proxies and client terrorist organizations against U.S. forces in the region. Had relaxed sanctions, to the tune of, we think about $80 billion to $100 billion, filling the coffers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, undesignated the Houthis, as a terrorist organization. All these kind of conciliatory things, which from our perspective, from the Biden administration's perspective, was meant to portray our willingness to engage them diplomatically. What the Iranians saw this as weakness, So I guess I would say that I would put this all under the headline of the perception of weakness is what provokes our adversaries. So that to the second part of your question, they perceive weakness because, in large measure, because of how politically polarized we are, and because of the vitriolic nature of our political discourse. And so, what I would like to see is U.S. politicians, from the president and those who oppose him in Congress. I mean, I think what they should do is to stop compromising our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. Stop compromising that confidence to score partisan political points. And so on the president's side, I would say this is his expansive view of Article 2 authorities. And the degree to which he is, in many ways circumventing Congress in some of these areas. The way that
unitary executive theory brought to practice.
Well,
right?
yeah, which is okay in my view in certain cases. I mean, for example, I don't think that bureaucrats should be unaccountable to the executive. I think that it is the president who gets elected.
Right.
So the president should be able to set the course for his policies, whether they're domestic policies, economic policies, and security policies, but also the degree to which politicians on both sides have compromised our confidence in due process of law, for example. With some of the president's kind of retribution agenda, but also under the Biden administration, the degree to which the Biden administration had gone after President Trump, or people actually in the state of New York, for example. I mean, it's supposed to start with the identification of a crime, and then you would investigate to figure out who committed the crime. Well, in this case, they identified a person. This is in the New York prosecution for President Trump, and then dug up something on him. So he came in with the sense of retribution, which then further politicized our institutions associated with rule of law, and our sense of justice. That's very dangerous. I would say the Biden administration was pushing a radical social agenda on the U.S. military. And that social agenda was, equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity, as well as kind of the valorization of victimhood, and this sort of affinity they have for various, postmodernist critical theories where, like, you should judge the person next to you based on their identity category instead of how we judge fellow soldiers, which is their sense of honor, their willingness to sacrifice for one another, for the mission, their courage, their toughness, and it's almost like they bought into some of this Ibrahim Kendi stuff where, like, the only way to deal with discrimination is more discrimination, and just that's crazy to me. So I think that now what you're seeing is when Secretary Hegseth came in their effort to get rid of some of that stuff, they further politicized the military, by trying to drag the military into partisan politics. And so, this narrative grew up around the military that if you were far left, you would say, "Oh, the military is extremist," which we know it's not. I mean, do we get extremist? Do we get racist? Do we get sexist in the military? Yeah, hell yeah. But you know what? Our culture is fundamentally intolerant of that, and we get rid of those people. And or on the far right that the military is woke. I don't know about you, Ike, but I don't know any woke admirals or generals, man. And so,
well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what when I still go back to the 1920s description definition, the genesis of woke being, you still look it up. Merriam-Webster still talks about the original concept of wokeness being an awakening to, one of the core founding and framing paradoxes of the American experience being a nation born out of all men are created equal and, civil liberty and rights, unalienable rights, but at the same time, paradoxically, structuring in inequality. Yeah, we've kind of thrown woke out as a cudgel.
I think here what we got to talk about is postmodernist, post-colonial and critical theories and certain tenets associated with them. One of which is that you should go for equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. Another is kind of the valorization of victimhood, right? So that you should organize people on a strata from oppressor to oppressed, and that's how you should see the world. This is a neo-Marxist kind of view of the world. And then this idea that you should, judge people by identity category, and so I think, that's really what we ought to be as specific about it, And
I would love to live in that idealized world in America specifically, and I would love that concept to be applied also to the opposite end of that spectrum, which would, if we could apply that sentiment to these notions of a great replacement theory. Right. I mean, we've now got a grievance narrative that's growing on the opposite end. To quote the president, as early as last night or this morning, talking about the civil rights movement, elements of the civil rights movement being quote unquote unfair to white Americans. I mean,
here's what I think is happening.
I would love to get back I'd love to get back to the middle. I'd love to get back to the civic middle.
Absolutely. I mean, I wrote about this in the book Battlegrounds in 2020 and essentially the way I understand this is essentially an interaction that creates centripetal forces between various critical theories and so forth to put the words institutional and structural in front of every problem, right? Thereby robbing us of agency to improve it, right? And which has, I think, in many ways, resurrected old forms of bigotry and racism on the other end of the spectrum. And then this is what's spinning us apart from each other. And the vast majority of Americans don't buy either one of that crazy extreme positions. But what has happened is really, I think, a number of things have happened that have delivered blows to America's psyche and eroded our common identity as Americans and the social fabric of our country. I think that this period I mentioned these kind of assumptions we bought into at the end of the Cold War, over optimism. I think that over optimism rapidly swung to pessimism and even resignation in the 2000s with the mass murder attacks of 9/11, but then the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then, how about the financial crisis, 2008, 2009? Toss in an opioid epidemic into that. And then the effects of social media whose business model is to get more and more clicks, to get more and more advertising dollars, and to do so by showing people more extreme content and various conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Then toss in a pandemic, George Floyd's murder and the violent aftermath to that. And then, it just goes on, right? So those traumas, I think, have as well as kind of the associated with it, vitriolic nature of our political discourse, is fragmenting our country, and it creates a perception of weakness. And our enemies take advantage of that, Ike.
Absolutely. I would too. Just from a campaigning and strategy approach, I would look for those cleavages, and I would aim to exploit them.
Well, this is what Russia, China, they're definitely doing it. I mean, it's very clear. The evidence is clear. Even going back to the 2016 elections, remember the narrative that that President Trump was an illegitimate president. That narrative on the far left. Hey, that helped the Russians out, tremendously. So Nancy Pelosi and Rachel Maddow, hey, congratulations, you just helped out the Russians. You could hear the champagne glasses clinking.
Would we say the same in 2020?
Yeah, but that's right. To even a higher level, President Trump made it even worse in 2020, right? With the with inciting or inspiring, encouraging, I guess, the assault on the Capitol and the election denial activities, that he was engaged in. The candidate for governor in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, she contributed to that kind of stuff too. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of politicians who compromise our confidence in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes to either advance their own agenda or to score partisan political points. And so what you need at this moment, and hey, by the way, I'll just go back to 2016, because I was National Security Advisor in 2017.
Yeah.
And obviously was paying a lot of attention to Russia's sustained campaign of disinformation, what we're calling Russian new generation warfare, cognitive warfare, cyber-enabled information warfare, whatever you want to call it, right? And what we found is that 80% of the Russian disinformation efforts were on issues of race, to try to divide Americans based on race.
Yes.
Then the second was on the border, right? And then the third was on gun control and the right to gun ownership.
Right.
So what they do is they look at what's dividing us. They don't create the divisions, but they try to divide us further, And then our politicians play right into it. I mean, come on. I mean, where we saw this recently is after Charlie Kirk's murder. You saw immediately after that, the Russians and the Chinese, this has been well documented.
Yes.
Came right in to try to pull people apart even further. So what's the role of leadership, right? Leadership, I think, is to get to the politics of addition, right? Hey, let's begin conversations with what we can agree on, and we could get a lot done if we just focused on what we can agree on. How about injecting some more civility into our political discourse,
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm starting to lose faith in the political class to do that, man. They're not going to do it. So we can't wait for the political class to do that.
Right.
This is why I love Arizona State University and what they're doing with promoting the kind of civil discourse, I mean, they're a lead. I mean, ASU is a leader in a lot of things, but what they've done with this forum on civil discourse is fantastic.
Yes.
And they bring in controversial people, but they do it in a respectful way. It's okay to be controversial.
That's right.
As long as you have respect for that person as a fellow human being. And you know what, man?
I would say it's a hard blood and treasure earned American right.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I point out whenever I can kind of the dangers of these various critical theories, right? Because if you put the word institutional and structural in front of every problem, you rob people of agency.
Well,
what are you left with? You're left with a toxic combination of anger and resignation.
Well, let me offer another interpretation of that, because I one at the heart of America. So travelers, we've of all the things that General McMaster is, he's also a genuine bona fide historian. I'm a political scientist by my background, so the fact that we've had, we're not supposed to like each other, not supposed to engage each other academically in the world of academia, because historians and political scientists kind of are, framed as contenders. But the truth always lies in the middle. And from an American political development standpoint, critical theory lies at the heart of, it's Lockean. I think what you're talking about, General, is more in terms of
I'm talking about an orthodox
prefix types of critical theory. Critical
I'm talking
theory,
about sort of a neo-Marxist orthodox.
Yeah, you're talking plainly, but to put it bluntly, you're talking about critical race thery. Right, you're talking about CRT.
It's all sorts of critical theories, right? So you've got
but in this context, critical race theory, where I would put, just like CRT, I would put GRT in the same category. I'd put great replacement theory as kissing cousins on the horseshoe extremes that are closer together than they are in terms of drawing us from the middle.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think that's exactly the way to think about it is, these extremes kind of make the same, similar arguments, and feed off each other in a lot of ways. And so from a historian
with a generation of fear in the middle of it, right? A fear of other.
Yeah, right.
Othering.
And we've been through this in our country before, with from everything with the in the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and the KKK in the South, or the Know Nothing Party, for example, the anti-immigration movement in the late 19th century. So the way I think we have to understand this is that we should kind of question these orthodoxies in the academy and secondary education, but not say, hey, you can't teach these perspectives on history. But what's happened, I think, Ike, is that interpretation of history that is tied to kind of post-colonial theory, and I'm going to oversimplify here, that all of the ills of the world prior to 1945 are due to colonialism. All of the ills of the world after 1945 are due to capitalist imperialism. What this interpretation of the world is profoundly arrogant. Because it kind of, doesn't acknowledge the agency and authorship over the future that others have.
I frankly love the agency as an American. I love the agency you're bringing in. But another interpretation of the institutional structured inequality argument is that looking for structured inequality and inequities is and could be, from a policy standpoint, from a civic engagement standpoint, a way of taking the finger pointing blame away from individual to individual and us collectively looking at what is structured in. That's a different interpretation.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
It's not necessarily counter agency. It's right.
Yeah, right. It does. So here's what I see going on that's really troubling from a historian's perspective is that the sort of the reaction to the various kind of interpretations of history, like the 1619 Project and so forth. The reaction to that is among some people is to try to replace that version of history with a contrived, happy view of history, much like existed, in the Jim Crow South, right, where they're portraying slavery as a benign instead of criminal institution.
That lost cause narrative,
or the myth of the lost cause. Yeah, exactly. Right. So, hey, I think we can't buy into this nonsense, right?
Yeah.
What we have to do is to your point, part of our agency is to acknowledge that, hey, it still matters the zip code into which you were born.
Exactly.
Because that determines the number of obstacles you have to overcome to take advantage of the great promise of this country.
And that's true for Black, brown, and white folks. I mean, I'm just thinking of places like Appalachia, right? I mean, this is another ism, right? A wealth gap in socioeconomic socioeconomic disparities, right? I mean, that transcends all those other ism separations, right?
Yeah, so let's do something about it, man.
You mentioned
there's a great guy. A great guy. There's a book, Agency, by Ian Rowe. I don't know if you know this book.
I do.
And he's the founder of Vertex Academies. And one of his schools is in the Bronx, and it's in an underserved community. And the whole theme, the cultural theme through that school is to restore agency. And every morning, they recite the Pledge of Allegiance and then the poem Invictus, and I think, really, let's do something let's be like Ian Rowe, roll up our sleeves and do something about it, man.
You're reminding me of President Mandela's speech.
Yeah.
On the soccer pitch.
Yeah.
Right. Soon
rugby,
after he
rugby.
Rugby pitch. Yes. Well, you're the historian. So on the rugby pitch,
I'm also a washed-up rugby player. Yeah. So exactly.
So a double insult to you. Sorry about that, Gerald. Sorry about that. I want to. I don't know. I'm going to do a weird thing and turn my back. Let me see if I can get the shot right. You can see in some cases on my bookshelf, you'd mentioned 1619 Project and how that narrative can feed a blowback extreme response of a hyper happy, neo return to a lost narrative reverb. I think the whole story of America, you have to include, I would start with Dunbar's book, The Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. You go through 1619 Project, and these are, I'm pointing at I've got the whole story of us, but it's not one book, I guess is my point. It's the Indigenous Peoples, it's 1619, it's McCullough's 1776. That's for all of us. All of these are for all of us. And from there, it could be John Meacham's biography of John Lewis. His Truth Goes Marching On. It could go through James Baldwin. It could go through Stonewall. It could go through the feminist mystique, right? And I have all those books intentionally lined up to tell that narrative. I think our problem is in its bad agency, I'll put it. Bad agency, partisan politicized agency that picks up on this extreme of an unknown and fear that lies in those unknowns, and intentionality of partisan political so-called leaders not leading in unified ways to pick any one of those books to divide and conquer and to use it as personal power. Yeah. But I think the whole story is all of those books I laid out and many more. And we're still writing the books, right? More and more towards that more perfect union. We can't self-select into one book that tells only one part of the story of us. And I think it's a really important point for us to have a little bit of a discussion on in this 250th year of relooking at a major mile marker of ourselves, relooking the American self in those key fundamental Zinn and Hook questions. Who counts as an American? Who do we intend to count as an American? Who governs? And probably most importantly, how democratic is America? With that on the table, thoughts on that? I know.
I would just say, hey, it's important to be open-minded, but don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. So I would just say, like,
what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, some of these interpretations of history, they are really efforts to manipulate history consistent with a presentist agenda, and I'm talking about efforts to sort of to portray slavery as a benign institution, or to pretend that the Civil War resolved once and for all. Equality of opportunity in the country. It didn't, right?
Yeah.
So I think I put 1619 in the same category of manipulating history based on a presentist agenda. So would every other historian, who reviewed that main thesis that the country was founded to preserve slavery, rather than what I think is the accurate interpretation. It was founded on principles that ultimately made that criminal institution untenable and set conditions for Black Americans and white Americans to work together to end that criminal institution and fight our most destructive war over it, to emancipate 4 million of our fellow Americans. And then, of course, though, what we should teach is that, hey, that didn't resolve the problem. You had the failure of Reconstruction, and students should understand why Reconstruction failed, and the rise of Jim Crow and the rise of the KKK, and then to understand the periods in which Black Americans contributed to continue to secure our country and serve our country. The story of Black Americans and Black units in World War I, and we should learn about their contributions and learn that one of the most famous of those regiments had to fight with the French, because of kind of racist attitudes among some American commanders. And then we should learn that when these veterans came back, they thought, hey, I deserve equal rights, equal say in how I'm governed, and that gave more impetus to Jim Crow. This is when a lot of the monuments were erected in the South. This is when U.S. military posts in the South were named for Confederate generals, right?
Yes.
And so there
Yes.
was this accommodation between North and South that occurred around the time of World War I, but it was an accommodation of white Americans at the expense of blacks, right? I mean,
Right.
so you have to
Right.
teach all this, and then you have to acknowledge that there
Yeah.
was progress beyond that with the civil rights
Yeah.
movement and
Yeah.
the achievements of the civil rights movement. So I just think what we have to do, and what we ought to maybe encourage our young people to do, is, question any orthodoxy that's pushed on you. And
Totally
like what I'm concerned about is not in every department, but in most departments in higher education, in the humanities, in history, in sociology, and linguistics, in education departments, they've been captured, I think, in large measure by people who adhere to that kind of what I would call a far left or new left orthodoxy. And there, I mean, we can look at why this happened, how it happened. It really was during the post Vietnam period.
Yeah.
Now, hey, that interpretation of history always existed. This is Charles and Mary Beard. This is William Appleton
Exactly.
Williams.
Exactly.
That's okay. There should be that interpretation available to students, but it shouldn't be the only interpretation, Ike.
Yeah, well, that's you've made my point more eloquently. That's why it's not one book; it's a series of books.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my question to you, I'm so glad you teed this up the way you did and framed this the way you did. How do we teach that when we're in a moment today, where many of those books are selectively being pulled off of bookshelves to include in our joint professional military education institutions? Selectively, right?
Yeah, I think you just have to, well, for the military, I mean, obviously, you just don't want to get involved in this. You got to keep that bold line in place between the military and partisan politics, and this is where I think. But
you mentioned the heritage. You mentioned the heritage of some of our great, just an example, some of our great African American, Black American soldiers. People call them now, I guess, with a bit of a pejorative, contemporary wokeness, the first, right? Those who are the first, and those people being stricken off of everything from biographies in national museums to tombstones in Arlington National Cemetery. Right.
Yeah.
What does that say about? I love what you've laid out, but there seems to be an inherent great paradox between that notion in aim and current contemporary policy. How do we? There's a big gap.
The way to do that is to learn history, to look at primary documents, to read kind of balanced secondary sources. I mean,
yes.
I think of the work of Kowalski Salter as a great historian of the Black American experience.
Yeah.
But what he says is like he integrates the history of Black Americans into the history of America, right?
Yes.
And so this is also what the African American History Museum does well in Washington, D.C. as well. It shows that the history of Black Americans is the history of America. You can't understand America without it. And so you have to place it in broader context of our overall experience. And I think the theme that holds up across all of American military history is that our republic on our 250th anniversary is today, as our founders knew it to be, a work in progress that required, in their words, constant nurturing, And so have we made progress? Hell yes. Has it been linear? No. It's been uneven.
I mean, where do you see us today? And how do we get back?
Yeah,
and we probably begin to close here. I know we're pressing the graciousness of your time, so maybe we can start to begin to end with this kind of line of conversation. Yeah.
Well, it really begins. It goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, Ike. I mean, it's like how about some civility, man? How about recognizing, obviously the different cultures and races and sexual orientations, everything. But let's not, let's also be cognizant of our common humanity. I mean, you and I, we've been abroad, man. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, and of course you recognize cultural differences. You respect cultural differences.
Yes.
But what my experience in all those places was we had more in common based on our common humanity than
Yeah.
our differences. So let's acknowledge, and that's something we can work with.
But
Our common identity.
we witnessed in all those over there places. We saw it, we smelled it, we felt it, right? It's proprioceptive. We breathed it in. We saw that humanity dehumanize, break down. And
Yeah.
one of the things that haunts me, one of the things that motivated me to do the Substack, Compound Security Unlocked, and the companion here, the Civic Brief, is because as a veteran coming home, you walk the streets of America and those old worrisome smells and senses and sights start to look all too familiar of what we saw as the rudiments of what became insurrections, insurgencies, and violent extremists, terroristic moments, breakdowns of social contracts and compacts in all the over there places. The wind smelling, sensing way too familiar here in the United States of America. What are your thoughts on that? And do you?
Well, I'm not as concerned as you are, because I think that, those concerns, they're not
Sure.
unfounded. They're
Yeah.
not unfounded,
Right.
but they come, I think, because of the amplification of these far extremes. I believe that and I'm sitting here in the middle of Stanford University. I have the privilege of spending time at ASU. I
Yep.
mean, the vast majority of the students I interact with, they don't buy the nonsense on either end of that spectrum, right? And so I think that the time is now, for all of us, wherever we are, to
Yeah.
convene our fellow Americans, right? To have meaningful, respectful discussions about how we can work together to build a better future, and when I have discussions here at Stanford or at ASU or anywhere, I sense that is the sentiment of the vast majority of Americans,
No, that's one of the reasons why I teach.
and
I
for
always
those-
teach.
Yeah.
Yeah, and at ASU, I have a similar experience, right? It's one of the, it's a service that I do to teach, but I'll be honest, it's also a bit self-focused because it's a way of kind of refueling and getting remotivated in terms of the long run. And that's the investment in our American future towards a more collective, pluralistic, perfect union, and get us out of some of these divergent tendencies today, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then also, we do have this tendency towards self-flagellation. I think we should be self-critical, but I think if more Americans spent time in the places we spent time abroad, that they would be more grateful for,
Well, later in the year, I may ask you to come back on and we can have a conversation about a 21st century form of national service.
Yeah.
That could bring us to that very place, because I could not agree with you more on that. General, if I could steal a couple more minutes of your time, I'd love to quickly go through a lightning round. I got some questions and maybe just a quick response from you, if that's okay. It's
Absolutely.
okay for you to say no too. I know you're very gracious with the time today. Okay, here's a few questions. One founding paradox we still misunderstand as Americans.
Well, from our founding, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would just say that it's it's just a constant tension, and it's like kind of the separation of powers, and I think that there's a tendency to believe that power between the branches is shifting inexorably in favor of one branch or another, when in fact they were designed to be in tension with one another.
Yes.
And so I have confidence that our republic will prevail because of how brilliant the design was in 1787.
How about one strategic myth we must retire?
Okay, so I guess one strategic myth would be that the U.S. can achieve the outcome it wants based on either what it does or chooses not to do, because we continue to sort of fall victim to strategic narcissism and the failure to consider the emotions, the aspirations, and the ideology that drive and constrain adversary and rival behavior.
Yeah, excellent. Let's end on a positive one. One civic habit that makes strategy smarter.
Well, I think it's Americans exercising their say in how they're governed based on who they elect to the Congress of the United States and how they make their sentiments known to their elected representatives.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to leave you with this question. It's an unfair one because we didn't talk about it before. We're coming up on the midterms, and we're coming up on the backside of that with the 2028 elections. With the state of union or disunion today, we the people, what I worry about most is a lack of fidelity, a growing lack of fidelity of the people to their governing institutions and the concepts and the ideals behind them. And regardless of how the elections go, midterm and national election going into 2028, how do we get through the trust deficit so that the election, whatever the outcome, will be trusted and fidelity will be found there by we the people? Any thoughts on that to kind of you leave us with an epilogue as prologue for going into the calendar year 26 conversation on the Civic Brief, General?
Again, don't compromise confidence in our democratic principles to score partisan points. And anything that improves the transparency of elections is a good thing. Yeah, I mean, the idea that to show your ID to vote is the equivalent of Jim Crow, that's nuts. Or the idea that voting should be invalidated. I mean, it's just stop it. Just and just recognize that more transparency, greater security of our elections, which should aim at ensuring that every person who has a right to vote has access to voting. We can do that. We can do that. So let's take the security of our elections out of this partisan vitriol and do what makes sense.
I love it, General. As always, you've been incredibly graceful and incredibly candid. And I count on that. We've known each other a long time. I treasure the relationship, past, present, and going into the future. Thanks a lot for your time, and thanks for helping us do a great kickoff for calendar 26, the Civic Brief. And fellow travelers, this is the first episode. There'll be 3 more of this experience in exploring paradoxes, founding and framing for the month of January's experience. And you can also find companion pieces on Compound Security Unlocked. I want to encourage you to go out there and revisit. If you haven't visited, first and foremost, go visit for the first time General McMaster's excellent books. He mentioned Battlegrounds. I would draw you even further back. The young senior captain, young major, and dereliction of duty. It was prominent and foresighted then, and a lot of those parallels need to be revisited today as we look to reinforce civil-military relations at home and abroad. And sir, I know you have a podcast as well. You do a lot of civic engagement yourself. If you want to make a shout out to draw people there, please do. But with that said, I'll give you the last word, and thanks again for your time and your participation.
Hey, thanks, Ike. It's a privilege to be with you, and I do try, as you are, and I'm so grateful you're doing it, to try to promote meaningful, thoughtful discussion of the challenges we're facing, and do that on today's Battlegrounds, on the Goodfellow Show, and on in the Substack blog, free blog called History We Don't Know. So
love it.
Thanks, Ike.
Outstanding. Thanks, General. Cheers.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.
Leadership isn't tested in theory, it's tested in crisis. Founded by former U.S. intelligence officer Jeremy Boss, Black Horizon LLC is a leadership and strategic simulation company that prepares leaders for real-world uncertainty through immersive geopolitical simulations that put leaders inside high-pressure decision environments. Join Black Horizon's flagship exercise, Baltic Storm, a geopolitical simulation, on February 25th and 26th. featuring retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Milford H. Beagle Jr., who will examine escalation, deterrence, and alliance dynamics in today's complex global landscape. Train your judgment. Strengthen your strategy. Spots are limited and registration is filling quickly. To learn more or to secure your seat, visit the Black Horizon website at blackhorizon.net. That's BLKHRZN.net.